She was not a guest. The carriage that deposited her before the severe grey face of Blackwood Manor was a hired conveyance, not a private barouche, and the driver did not wait for a footman, but unloaded her 3 trunks himself, setting them on the gravel with a thud that seemed to echo the grim finality of the place. Elara Vance paid him the last of her coin, her gloved fingers counting out the shillings with a precision that belied the tremor in her hands. She stood alone for a long moment after the carriage rattled away, a small, resolute figure in mourning gray, dwarfed by the twin stone griffins that guarded the entrance. The house did not welcome. It loomed. Inside, the chill was not merely physical. It was a quality of the air, of the light that struggled through tall, mullioned windows to fall in weak rectangles on the black and white marble floor of the great hall. A housekeeper, starched and silent as a sentinel, led her through corridors where the portraits of past Beaumonts watched with identical expressions of haughty indifference. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her, assessing the worn nap of her cloak, the disciplined set of her jaw. Elara met their gaze without flinching. She had been in the company of the dead her entire life, on canvas and in memory. They held no terror for her. It was the living who were the greater trial. He was in the library. Of course he was. It was the room in any great house that best projected an image of serious, masculine purpose. The Duke of Blackwood, Alastair Beaumont, did not rise when she entered. He was standing by the fire, one hand braced on the marble mantelpiece, a letter held loosely in the other. He was taller than she had imagined, his form silhouetted against the flames, severe and unyielding as the architecture of his home. "Miss Vance," he said. The voice was low, cultivated, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was the voice of a man accustomed to giving orders, not making introductions. He did not turn. "Your Grace," Elara curtsied, a shallow, professional gesture. She was here as a tradeswoman, a painter for hire. The conventions of society were a language she spoke fluently, even if her own standing was now too precarious to afford her a place within its pages. He finally turned, and she saw the face that matched the voice. It was a handsome face, all sharp angles and unforgiving lines, as if carved from the same granite as his house. His eyes were a startlingly pale gray, and they assessed her with a look of frank, dismissive appraisal. He saw a woman in her late 20s, plainly dressed, with hair the color of autumn leaves pinned too severely, and hands that, despite the gloves, bore the faint, telltale stains of her trade. He saw a paid dependent. "My sister believes you are the finest portraitist in the county," he stated, as if reporting a dubious scientific finding. "She is prone to enthusiasms." The insult was delivered with the casual indifference of a man who did not even consider he was giving one. Ilara's chin lifted a fraction of an inch. "Lady Beatrice is a discerning patron of the arts, Your Grace." A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps at her refusal to be cowed, passed through his eyes. "My father held your father's work in high esteem. He considered him a master of truth, a rare quality in a painter." "My father painted what he saw," Elara said, her voice quiet but firm. It was the highest praise she could give, and the core of her own creed. "Indeed." The Duke moved from the fire, his boots silent on the thick Turkish carpet. He stopped before a heavy velvet curtain that covered a significant portion of one wall. "The commission is a simple one, a posthumous portrait. My late wife, the Duchess Isabella." He did not say her name with affection, or even with sorrow. He said it like a fact, a piece of data in a long and tedious equation. He made a gesture to the housekeeper, who stepped forward with a noiseless efficiency that spoke of years of practice. With a soft rasp of brass rings on a wooden pole, The curtain was drawn back. There, on a heavy gilt easel, sat an empty, waiting canvas. It was enormous. Beside it, on a small velvet-draped table, was a single object, a miniature portrait, no larger than the palm of a man's hand, set in a frame of gold and pearl. "This is all we have," the Duke said, his voice flat. "And our memories, of course. Lady Beatrice will provide you with the necessary details, the color of her hair in sunlight, the gowns she favored, the precise shade of her eyes." He did not look at the miniature. He looked at the blank canvas, his expression unreadable, and then back at Elara. "We require a portrait for the gallery, something appropriate, something that captures her spirit. She was gentle, a delicate creature." The words felt rehearsed, hollow. He was not describing a woman. He was listing specifications for a product. Elara stepped forward, her professional instincts overriding her social trepidation. She picked up the miniature. The artist had been skilled. The face that looked up at her was one of angelic beauty. Wide, innocent eyes of a forget-me-not blue, a Cupid's bow mouth, skin of porcelain perfection. Isabella Beaumont was a confection of virginal white and pale gold, a creature from a Rossetti poem. But as Elara's trained eye examined the brushwork, the infinitesimal details, she saw the lie. It was too perfect. The light was too even, the smile too placid. There was no shadow, no hint of the person behind the mask of idealized femininity. This was not a portrait of a woman. It was an icon. "She was painted 2 years before her death," a new voice said. Lady Beatrice had entered, as silent as a wraith. She was a handsome woman, a decade older than her brother, with the same pale eyes, but none of his stark severity. Hers was a face of smooth, calculated composure. She had been unwell. The artist captured her at her best. Elara looked from the flawless miniature to the vast, empty canvas. They were asking her to take this flat, perfect lie and inflate it to the scale of truth. They were asking her to paint a ghost from a script. "I will require a room for a studio," Elara said, her voice steady. "One with a north-facing window, if possible. And I will need to see her gowns, her jewelry, the rooms she inhabited." Lady Beatrice smiled, a thin, satisfied expression. "Of course. Mrs. Gable will show you. We want you to have everything you need to create a masterpiece, Miss Vance. A fitting tribute." Alistair had already turned back to the fire, his part in the transaction concluded. "See to it, Beatrice," he murmured, dismissing them all with a wave of his hand. As Elara followed the housekeeper from the room, she glanced back. The Duke stood staring into the flames, a solitary, rigid figure. And on the table, the perfect, smiling miniature of his dead wife seemed to watch him with vacant, untroubled eyes. But Elara, whose father had taught her to see the truth in the line of a jaw, in the shadow beneath an eye, felt a cold certainty settle in her heart. This house was not merely sad, it was haunted. Not by the ghost of a delicate, gentle duchess, but by the suffocating weight of a story that everyone had agreed to believe, and that no one, it seemed, had ever bothered to check if it were true. They had asked her to paint a portrait. She felt, with a shiver of premonition, that she had been hired to maintain a lie. Her studio was a disused solar at the top of the west wing. It was perfect. A great arched window faced north, flooding the room with the cool, consistent light that was a painter's most precious commodity. Dust motes danced in the pale shafts of sun, and the air smelled of old wood, beeswax, and forgotten things. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, had her trunks brought up, along with an assortment of dust-sheeted furniture resurrected from the attics. "Her Grace, the late Duchess, never cared for this wing," Mrs. Gable offered, her voice low as she smoothed a linen cloth over a trestle table. The remark was delivered neutrally, but Alara was learning to read the silences and inflections of the house. It was not a criticism, but a statement of fact that contained a universe of unspoken information. "It has the best light in the house," Alara replied, unrolling her canvas satchels of brushes and tools. The familiar scent of linseed oil and turpentine was a comfort, a small pocket of her own world in this strange, cold place. "She was not one for strong light," Mrs. Gable continued, her back to Alara as she fussed with a vase. "Delicate health, you see." There it was again, the mantra of the house: delicate, gentle, fragile. Alara made a non-committal sound and began to set up her easel, placing the large, intimidatingly blank canvas upon it. For the first few days, she did not paint. She prepared. She ground her own pigments, a laborious, meditative process her father had insisted upon. The rhythmic scrape of the muller on the glass slab was a familiar song. "Lapis lazuli for the Virgin's robe," her father used to say, "and for the eyes of queens. Malachite for the deep greens of a forest. Cochineal for a blush, or the velvet of a king's coat." She was mixing colors for a woman she had never met, based on the second-hand descriptions of a sister-in-law, determined to construct a saint. Lady Beatrice visited daily, her visits brief and purposeful. She brought gowns of pale silk and muslin, whispering how Isabella had loved the feel of them, how they had complemented her fairness. She brought a jewel box, pointing out a string of pearls. A wedding gift from the Duke. She was never without them. Each object was presented as a piece of evidence for the prosecution of perfection. Alara sketched. She filled a book with charcoal studies of fabric, the fall of light on a pearl, the curve of a swan's neck that Lady Beatrice swore was the very image of Isabella's. But she did not touch the face. The face in the miniature was a beautiful mask, and Alara knew, with an instinct honed by years of study, that to simply enlarge it would be to create a monstrosity of emptiness. A true portrait was not an aggregation of features. It was the revelation of a soul. And Isabella's soul was conspicuously absent. She walked the house. In the evenings, when the family had retired, she would move through the silent rooms, her sketchbook in hand. She felt like a detective searching for clues. The grand gallery was a cold, formal space, each portrait hanging in a state of splendid isolation. The drawing room was a masterpiece of uncomfortable elegance. But it was the library that drew her. It was the only room in the house that felt truly lived in, though it was the exclusive domain of the Duke. One evening, she found him there, not by the fire, but at a massive oak desk submerged in a sea of paperwork. Ledgers, maps, letters. He was not reading for pleasure. He was working. The lamplight carved his face into stark planes of light and shadow, deepening the lines of concentration around his eyes. He looked up as she entered, his expression one of sharp annoyance. "The library is not a public thoroughfare, Miss Vance." "I apologize, Your Grace. I was looking for a book on Italian frescoes. I saw it on the shelf yesterday." She did not retreat. Her father had taught her that to show fear was to invite dismissal. He stared at her for a long moment. "Which one?" She gave him the title. He rose without a word, walked to a high shelf, and retrieved the heavy folio, his movements economical and precise. He did not hand it to her. He placed it on a reading stand. "You are a student of the old masters?" he asked. his tone betraying a grudging curiosity. "One must study the foundations to understand the form," she replied, her fingers tracing the tooled leather spine of the book. "My father believed a painter who does not know their history is merely a decorator." "Your father again." He said it not unkindly, but as a simple observation. "He looms large in your estimation." "He was my teacher, my only teacher." Alogester nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the empty fireplace. "A formidable legacy to uphold." He seemed to be speaking more to himself than to her. He gestured to the ledgers on his desk. "My father left a different sort of legacy. Less beautiful, more complicated." It was the first time he had spoken to her as anything other than an employee. It was a crack in the granite facade, no wider than a hair, but it was there. She saw in that moment a man burdened by duty, chained to a name and an estate that was, perhaps, as much a prison as a privilege. "All legacies are complicated, Your Grace," she said softly. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and for an instant the pale gray eyes held not dismissal, but a flicker of shared understanding. It was gone as quickly as it came. He gave a curt nod and returned to his desk, the lord of the manor once more. Ilara retreated with her book, but she took the memory of that moment with her. The Duke was not merely cold, he was contained. He had built walls around himself as high and as thick as those of Blackwood Manor. Her search for Isabella continued. She spoke to the staff, not with direct questions, which she knew would be met with silence, but with the quiet observation of a painter. She learned more from a groom's hesitation when asked about the Duchess's favorite mare, or a housemaid's sudden fascination with a dust mote when Isabella's name was mentioned, than she ever did from Lady Beatrice's polished eulogies. The official story was that the Duchess was a poor horsewoman, afraid of the animals. But the old groom let slip, just once, that "Her Grace had a lighter hand with the reins than any man in the county," when she thought no one was watching. The contradictions mounted. The fragile creature who was afraid of strong light had a room in the unused west wing with the best light in the house. The delicate woman who only wore pale muslins had, according to a junior maid, a collection of riding habits in greens and deep blues that had been packed away and never spoken of again. One afternoon, driven by a frustration she could not articulate, Ilara found herself in the gardens. The formal roses were Lady Beatrice's domain, but beyond a high yew hedge was a smaller, wilder space. A knot garden, long since neglected, its intricate patterns blurred by overgrown herbs. And at its center, half hidden by a tangle of climbing ivy, was a small stone folly. It was little more than a summer house, its door warped by damp and time. A simple brass key was in the lock, green with verdigris. On a whim, she turned it. The lock was stiff, but it gave with a groan of protest. The door swung inward on a single hinge, releasing a sigh of stale, trapped air. The room was small, circular, and filled with a soft, dusty light from a high, domed skylight. It was empty, save for a scattering of what looked like rubbish. Canvases stacked against the wall, their faces turned away. A broken easel, jars of dried, cracked pigment, and on the floor, a leather-bound book, its cover warped and stained. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She stepped inside, the scent of old turpentine and linseed oil, a ghostly echo of her own studio. She knelt and picked up the book. It was a sketchbook. Her fingers, trembling slightly, opened it. It was not the work of a dilettante. The pages were filled with powerful, angry charcoal sketches. a storm-blasted tree. A horse, its muscles straining, its eyes rolling in terror. A self-portrait, but one so different from the miniature, it was like looking at another species. The face was the same, but it was a face stripped of all artifice. The eyes were not forget-me-not blue, but a turbulent, stormy gray. The mouth was not a Cupid's bow, but a thin, tight line of furious restraint. This was not a gentle spirit. This was a caged one. Ilera rose and turned to the stacked canvases. Her hands were unsteady as she lifted the first one and turned it to the light. It was a portrait of the Duke. But not the Duke she knew, the cold, remote master of Blackwood. This was a younger Alastair, his face unguarded, his expression one of open, laughing affection. He was looking at someone outside the frame, the painter. The brushwork was bold, confident, full of a passionate energy that was the absolute antithesis of the placid miniature. She turned another canvas. It was a still life. A dead bird, a raven, its black feathers iridescent even in the dust, its claws curled in a final, rigid grasp. The painting was technically brilliant and emotionally devastating. This was the secret. Not a sordid affair, not a hidden madness, but something far more tragic. The Duchess Isabella had not been a delicate flower. She had been an artist. A powerful, talented, and utterly unacknowledged one. They had not merely lost a wife and a sister-in-law. They had erased a painter. They had taken her talent, her passion, her very soul, and locked it away in a forgotten folly, replacing it with the pretty, empty doll of the miniature. Ilera sank onto a dusty crate, the sketchbook in her lap, the ghost of Isabella's furious, frustrated talent filling the small room. She now understood the hollowness in the Duke's voice, the brittle perfection of Lady Beatrice's story. It was the frantic, desperate work of people trying to hold a fiction in place. She looked at the self-portrait again, at the stormy eyes that seemed to plead and accuse. They had asked her to paint a tribute, and now she knew what that meant. She would not paint the lie they had commissioned. She would paint the truth they had buried. She would give Isabella Beaumont the one thing she had been denied in life, a portrait that truly saw her. The commission was no longer simple, and her father's legacy felt less like a burden and more like a command. She would paint what she saw, and she had finally, truly seen. The next morning, Ilera began to paint. The hesitation was gone, replaced by a fierce, quiet certainty. She did not discard the miniature. She placed it on a small table beside her easel, a constant, necessary reminder of the lie she was dismantling. She began with the background, not the insipid pastel blues of the miniature, but a deep, turbulent sky of bruised purples and stormy grays, drawn from the sketches in Isabella's book. She mixed the colors with a kind of furious energy, her hands sure and swift. Lady Beatrice paid her customary visit, her brow furrowing at the ominous sky taking shape on the canvas. "Is that not a little dramatic, Miss Vance? I had imagined something more serene. A summer sky, perhaps." "The light is often most beautiful just before a storm, my lady," Ilera replied, her voice even, her eyes fixed on her work. "It reveals colors one does not otherwise see." Beatrice accepted this, for now, an artist's eccentricity. But she watched Ilera with a new, sharper attention. Ilera worked with a discipline that was almost a fever. She rose before dawn and worked until the light failed, stopping only for a piece of bread and cheese brought by a silent, watchful Mrs. Gable. She was no longer just a painter for hire. She was an advocate, an archaeologist of a buried life. She painted the figure of the Duchess, not in the virginal white of the miniature, but in a gown of deep forest green, the color of a riding habit glimpsed in a forgotten wardrobe. She rendered the fabric not as a flimsy muslin, but as a sturdy, practical wool, the kind a woman who was not afraid of the outdoors might wear. The face was the last and most difficult part. She began by sketching the bone structure, the perfect classical features from the miniature. The foundation was true. But then she began to add the shadows. She worked from the memory of that charcoal self-portrait in the Folly, from the stories she had pieced together. She gave the eyes their stormy, intelligent depth. She allowed a hint of impatience, of restless energy, to tighten the corner of the mouth. She painted the hands not as delicate, useless things, but as capable hands, one of them resting on a large, leather-bound book, not a book of poetry, but a folio, the kind one might find in a library. And in that hand, just visible, she painted the faint, telltale stain of pigment, a ghost of the cochineal she herself had ground. The Duke avoided her studio. After their brief encounter in the library, he had retreated behind his wall of cold formality. But Ilara felt his presence in the house. Sometimes, late at night, she would hear his solitary footsteps in the corridor below, a restless, pacing tread. She wondered if he was haunted by the same ghost she was now bringing to life on canvas. One afternoon, a visitor was announced. A Mr. Thomas Gillingham, a local architect who was consulting with the Duke on some matter of estate drainage. He was a pleasant, straightforward young man, with an open, honest face and a genuine appreciation for her work. He had seen her father's paintings in a London exhibition years ago. "A master of light," he said, his eyes full of sincere admiration as he looked at her own work in progress. "You have his gift, Miss Vance. This is alive." He was the first person in this house to speak to her as an equal, as a fellow professional. His uncomplicated respect was like a balm. They talked for an hour about Brunelleschi and the properties of lime plaster, and for that hour, Ilara felt like herself again. Not a dependent, not a conspirator, just a painter. The Duke appeared in the doorway as Mr. Gillingham was taking his leave. His gaze took in the scene, the two of them standing in easy conversation, the architect's warm smile, the flush on Ilara's cheeks, and his face hardened into a mask of stone. "Gillingham," he said, the single word a command. "The drainage plans await our attention." Mr. Gillingham, flustered, made his apologies and hurried away. The Duke's cold gray eyes rested on Ilara. "I trust you are not allowing yourself to be distracted from your commission, Miss Vance." The injustice of it stung. "Mr. Gillingham was admiring the work, Your Grace. The work you commissioned." "He was admiring you," the Duke corrected, his voice dangerously quiet. "This is a house of mourning, not a salon. I would ask you to remember that." He turned and was gone before she could form a reply. The coldness of his rebuke was shocking, but it was the possessiveness behind it that truly unsettled her. It was as if he could not bear to see her animated, to see her in conversation with another man. It was illogical, proprietary, and it had nothing to do with her work. She stood trembling in the silent studio, the warmth of Mr. Gillingham's praise extinguished by the Duke's glacial disapproval. The half-finished portrait of Isabella seemed to watch her with knowing, commiserating eyes. "I know this cage," it seemed to say. "I know this man." The work became her refuge, her only true companion. The portrait was nearing completion. It was a powerful, unsettling image. The woman on the canvas was undeniably beautiful, but her beauty was complex and challenging. She was not serene. She was intelligent, watchful, and deeply, profoundly melancholic. The storm in the background seemed to be a reflection of the tempest in her soul. In her left hand, she held the book. Her right hand, resting on the arm of the chair, was almost a fist, the knuckles white. And on her finger, instead of a wedding band, Hilera had painted a simple, unadorned signet ring, the Beaumont crest, the mark of ownership. But the final, crucial detail was the pearls. Lady Beatrice had insisted on them, so Hilera painted them, a perfect, luminous rope. But in her rendering, they did not look like a gift. They looked like a leash. The light caught them in such a way that they seemed to glow with a cold, imprisoning fire. Mrs. Gable was the first to see it in its almost finished state. She came in with a tray and stopped dead, her hand flying to her mouth. She did not speak for a full minute. She simply looked, her gaze traveling over every detail of the painting. "Saints above," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She put the tray down on a table, her hands shaking. "You saw her. You truly saw her." She looked at Hilera, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "He never did. Not until it was too late." It was the confirmation Hilera needed. It was also a warning. The truth had a power, but it was a dangerous power. The crisis came, as she knew it must, in the form of Lady Beatrice. She arrived for her inspection, a self-satisfied smile on her face, expecting to see the final, saccharine touches being applied to her hagiography. The smile vanished the moment she saw the canvas. Her face went white, then a mottled, furious red. "What is this?" she breathed, her voice a venomous hiss. "What have you done?" "I have painted the Duchess, my lady," Hilera said, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. "You have painted a monster, a shrew. Look at her eyes. Look at that mouth. This is not my brother's gentle, loving wife. This is some fury you have dredged from your imagination." She pointed a trembling finger at the canvas. "And the pearls. You have made them look like a manacle. This is a deliberate insult, an attack on our family, on her memory." "I painted what I saw in her work," Hilera said quietly. "In her true self." "Her work?" Beatrice scoffed. "She dabbled, as any lady might. It meant nothing." "It meant everything," Hilera countered, her own anger finally rising. "She was an artist, a brilliant one. And you buried her. You locked her away and put a pretty doll in her place." Lady Beatrice stared at her, speechless for a moment, her composure utterly shattered. "You have been snooping, prying into things that do not concern you. You are dismissed, Miss Vance. Pack your things. You will leave Blackwood this instant. You will not be paid." Hilera stood her ground. "The Duke commissioned this portrait. It is for him to approve or dismiss." "My brother will be horrified," Beatrice spat. "He will see this for the vicious slander that it is."
I will fetch him now, and he will throw you out himself." She swept from the room, a whirlwind of righteous fury, leaving a vibrating silence in her wake. Ilara stood before her creation, her hands clenched at her sides. The woman in the portrait seemed to look back at her, her painted eyes filled with a shared, defiant resolve. The storm she had painted on the canvas was about to break over the house itself. She had unearthed the truth. Now, she would see if Blackwood Manor could survive it. The wait was the longest 10 minutes of Ilara's life. The silence in the West Wing was absolute, a held breath before a thunderclap. She did not move from her position before the easel. She would face him here, in her own space, with her truth and Isabella's truth beside her. She heard their footsteps approaching down the long corridor, the rustle of Lady Beatrice's silk skirts, and the heavy, measured tread of the Duke. They appeared in the doorway, a tableau of impending judgment. Lady Beatrice's face was alight with a kind of triumphant fury. The Duke's was a mask of cold, unreadable granite. His pale eyes swept the room, taking in the organized chaos of her work, before finally settling on the portrait. He did not speak.
He walked slowly toward the easel, his gaze locked on the face Ilara had created. He moved like a man in a trance, his steps unnaturally quiet on the bare floorboards. Lady Beatrice began to speak, her voice sharp and accusatory.
"You see, Alistair? You see the mockery she has made of our Isabella? I told you she was not to be trusted. This is what comes of hiring these people. She has created a libel, a grotesque caricature born of her own vulgar imagination."
Alistair did not seem to hear her. He reached the easel and stopped, standing so close to the canvas that his breath might have misted the oil. He looked and looked and looked. His eyes traced the line of the jaw, the stormy depths of the eyes, the defiant set of the mouth. His gaze fell to the hands, to the book, to the faint stain of pigment on the finger, and then to the pearls, gleaming cold and heavy around the painted throat. For the first time since she had met him, Ilara saw the mask of the Duke of Blackwood fall away completely. What was left was not anger, but a deep, fathomless sorrow. A muscle worked in his jaw. His throat moved as he swallowed, a dry, difficult sound. "Leave us, Beatrice," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp.
"But Alistair, she must be dealt with. We cannot allow this thing to be seen."
"Leave us," he repeated, louder this time, the word cracking with an authority that was absolute. He did not take his eyes from the portrait. Lady Beatrice hesitated, her mouth open to protest further, but something in her brother's stance, something in the raw emotion that had broken through his voice, silenced her. She gave Ilara a look of pure hatred, then turned and swept from the room, her fury muted to a resentful, rustling retreat. The silence that descended was heavier than any before. It was filled with the weight of years of unspoken things. Alistair reached out a hand, his fingers stopping a mere inch from the canvas, as if he feared to touch it, as if he feared it might burn him. "I did not know," he whispered. The words were not addressed to Ilara. They were a confession to the woman in the portrait. "I truly did not know." He finally turned to face Ilara. The pale gray eyes were no longer cold. They were ravaged.
All the pain he had kept locked away behind the granite walls of his self-control was now visible, and it was a terrible thing to see. "Where did you find this woman?" he asked, his voice raw. Ilara gestured toward the window, in the direction of the forgotten folly. "She was there, in her studio, in her sketches, in the work you never saw." He closed his eyes, a shudder passing through his powerful frame. Her dabbles, Beatrice called them. She would lock herself away for hours. I thought it was a sign of her melancholy, her fragility. I encouraged her to ride, to attend dinners. I tried to draw her out of herself. A bitter, self-loathing laugh escaped him. I was trying to draw her out of the only place she was ever truly alive. He walked to the window and stared out at the manicured lawns, his back to her. "When we first married," he began, his voice distant, "she was radiant, full of fire. We would argue about everything: politics, poetry, the proper way to train a horse. She challenged me. She made me feel awake, and it terrified me. My father's marriage was a battlefield. My mother was a woman of immense passions and no discipline. She brought our house to the brink of ruin, financially and socially. I swore my own house would be a place of order, of principle, of peace." He turned back from the window, his face a landscape of regret. "So I began to quiet her. Gently, I thought, with kindness. I praised her serenity. I complimented her modesty. I bought her pale gowns and told her they made her look like an angel. Every time she showed a spark of that original fire, I would douse it with a bucket of placid, patronizing approval. I thought I was protecting her, protecting us.
What I was doing was building a prison." His confession hung in the air between them, more devastating than any accusation. Ilara's heart ached for him, for the blind, well-intentioned tragedy of it all. "She grew distant," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "The light in her went out. And then there was another, a poet from London, a man who saw her fire and wanted to warm his hands at it. He told her all the things she needed to hear, all the things I had forgotten how to say. When I found out, I was not heartbroken. I was vindicated. It confirmed everything I believed about the dangers of unbridled passion. It proved my principles were correct." He looked at the portrait again, and then at Ilara. "I broke her heart, Miss Vance, and then, when she sought solace elsewhere, I despised her for it. After her death, Beatrice and we constructed a story, the fragile saint, the tragic, delicate beauty. It was easier than admitting the truth. It was easier than admitting that I had taken a brilliant, passionate woman and remade her into something so small, so pale, that she finally simply faded away." He fell silent. The truth was finally out, raw and bleeding, in the quiet, dusty room. He had not defended himself. He had not made excuses. He had simply, finally, confessed. Ilara found her voice. "You didn't see her," she said softly. "But it is not too late for her to be seen." He looked from the portrait to Ilara, and for the first time, a new emotion entered his eyes. Not grief, not guilt, but a dawning, painful, and profound sense of recognition. He was not just looking at the painter of his wife's portrait. He was looking at a woman who had seen the truth when he had been blind to it. A woman who had wielded her own talent not to create a fiction, but to excavate a reality. He was seeing her. "What is your fee, Miss Vance?" he asked, the question startling in its practicality. "My fee was for the portrait you commissioned," she replied. "The one of the saint. This is something else. This is Isabella's portrait. It is not for sale." A long silence stretched between them. He walked back to the easel and looked at the painting one last time. He saw the intelligence, the fury, the sorrow, the imprisonment. He saw it all. "No," he said, his voice firm, resolute. "It is not for sale. It is a debt I owe her." He turned to Alara, his gaze direct and unwavering. "And you, I owe you a debt as well, one that cannot be paid in coin." He did not ask her to stay. He did not apologize for his sister's behavior or his own. He simply stood there, stripped bare of his ducal arrogance, a man finally confronting the wreckage of his own making. And in that raw honesty, Alara saw the first glimmer of the man Isabella must have once loved, the man who laughed in the painting she had found in the folly. The foundation was still there, buried under years of grief and principle. Perhaps, she thought, it was not too late for him to be seen either. The next morning, two things happened that shifted the very foundations of Blackwood Manor. The first was the arrival of a footman at Alara's door, bearing an envelope on a silver tray. It was not a dismissal. It was a bank draft for a sum so large it made her gasp. It was triple her original fee. With it was a note, in the Duke's stark, angular hand. It contained only 3 words: a partial payment. The second was more public. By the Duke's express order, a space was cleared in the Grand Gallery. Not in some shadowed corner, but in the most prominent position, directly opposite the main entrance. The ancestral portraits of stern-faced Beaumonts were shifted, their painted scowls of disapproval ignored. And there, in the place of honor, Alistair himself helped the footman hang Isabella's portrait. Alara watched from the doorway of the gallery, unseen. Lady Beatrice stood at the far end of the hall, her arms crossed, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. She had lost. The truth, in all its uncomfortable, complicated glory, was now the first thing any visitor to Blackwood would see. It was not a scandal being hidden, but a life being honored. The portrait was magnificent. In the cool, formal light of the gallery, it seemed to gather a new power. The storm in the background, the fire in the eyes, the tension in the hands. It was a declaration. I was here. I was real. See me. Alistair saw Alara lingering in the doorway and walked toward her. He stopped a few feet away, maintaining a respectful distance. "It is where she belongs," he said, his voice quiet. "Yes," Alara agreed. "It is. My sister believes I have lost my mind. Have you?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first she had ever seen there. It transformed his face, easing the harsh lines. "Perhaps. Or perhaps I have only just found it." He gestured to the painting. "You have given my wife back her voice, Miss Vance. You have performed a work of profound justice." "I only painted what was there."
No, he corrected her gently. You saw what was there. There is a world of difference. He hesitated, the vulnerability still new and strange on his features. The bank draft. It is not a dismissal. It is an apology. For my behavior. For my sisters. And for presuming that your talent could be bought and constrained to my specifications. Apology accepted, Your Grace. They stood in silence for a moment, the vast marble hall echoing with all the things that remained unsaid. The business between them was concluded. She was paid. The portrait was delivered. She was free to leave. The hired carriage could be summoned. She could go back to her small London rooms, her reputation secured, her finances restored. It was the sensible, professional thing to do. What will you do now, Miss Vance? He asked, as if reading her thoughts. I have not decided, she said, which was the truth. The thought of leaving Blackwood, which had once been her most fervent wish, now felt strangely like a desertion. The house was no longer just a cold stone edifice. It was a place where a truth had been unearthed, where a soul had been reclaimed. Her work was done, but the story felt unfinished. The estate archives are in a state of chaos, he said, his tone casual, almost conversational. My father was a collector of documents, but not a cataloguer. There are papers going back to the Tudors, deeds, letters, household accounts, a history of this place, written in ink and dust. It requires a mind that can see patterns, that can find the story in the details. He looked at her, his pale eyes holding hers. It requires a particular kind of artist. It was not a proposal of marriage. It was not a declaration of love. It was something far more rare and, to Ilara, far more valuable. It was a job offer, a recognition of her specific competence, her intelligence, her way of seeing. He was not asking her to be a duchess. He was asking her to be herself. The archives are in the East Wing, I believe, Ilara said, a slow smile spreading across her own face. I have been told it has very poor light. I will have the windows enlarged, Alastair Beaumont said, and the smile that he gave her in return was real, and it was warm, and it was full of the promise of a future that was yet to be written. She would stay, not as a dependent, not as a secret, but as a partner in the slow, patient work of bringing a house and a man back into the light. 5 years later, the light in Blackwood Manor was different. It was warmer, softer, no longer struggling through grimy panes of glass, but pouring in, generous and bright. It fell on hallways where the scent of beeswax and lemon had replaced the smell of dust and regret. It illuminated bowls of fresh flowers, piles of books left open on tables, and the occasional discarded wooden toy. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the distant sounds of life, the laughter of a child in the gardens, the murmur of conversation, the clear, confident notes of a pianoforte. In the West Wing Solar, which was still Ilara's studio, a new portrait sat upon the easel. It was smaller than Isabella's, more intimate. It depicted a young boy of about 4, with his father's serious gray eyes and his mother's unruly auburn hair. He was not posed stiffly in a velvet suit, but captured in a moment of rapt concentration, a collection of brightly painted wooden birds arranged before him. The light in the painting was the gentle, forgiving light of a late afternoon. Ilara, Duchess of Blackwood, added a final, deft stroke to the feathers of a tiny painted wren. Her hand was as steady as ever, but the fierce, defensive energy was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet contentment.
She was still a painter. It was the first and most important clause in the unwritten contract of her marriage. Alastair had not asked her to give up her work. He had built her a new studio, larger and better equipped than the last, and considered its use as vital to the health of the estate as the rotation of crops. She heard his step in the doorway and turned, a smile ready on her lips. Alastair stood there, no longer the granite figure of her memory, but a man at ease in his own home, in his own skin. The harsh lines of his face had been softened by happiness. He held a leather-bound ledger in his hand. "The accounts for the North Farm," he said, placing it on her work table. "They don't add up. I thought perhaps you might see the pattern I'm missing." It was their ritual. He brought her the problems of the estate, not as a burden, but as a matter of course. He valued her mind, her sharp eye for the telling detail that others overlooked. She, in turn, found a deep satisfaction in the practical application of her skills, in helping to nurture the land and the people who lived on it. They were partners, in the truest sense of the word. She took the ledger, her fingers brushing his. The casual touch still sent a small, pleasant shock through her. "I'll look at it after supper," she promised. "Arthur has discovered a family of hedgehogs by the west wall and has demanded a formal introduction." Alastair's smile was warm with affection. "I will inform the hedgehogs to expect a visit from their duke." He came to stand behind her, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders, his gaze on the portrait of their son. "You've captured him," he said softly. "That look of intense, serious joy. It's the way you look when you're working." She leaned back against him, the familiar scent of his coat, of leather and wool, and the crisp outdoor air, a profound comfort. "He is his mother's son." "And his father's," Alastair added. "He has a formidable sense of principle when it comes to the proper arrangement of wooden birds." They stood in comfortable silence, looking at the portrait of their child. Through the open door, they could see down the long corridor to the main gallery. From this angle, Isabella's portrait was visible, hanging in its place of honor. The stormy, magnificent, tragic woman still watched over the house. She was no longer a secret or a shame. She was an ancestor. Arthur called her Aunt Isa, the painter aunt. Her studio in the Folly had been restored, her canvases cleaned and preserved. It was a place of pilgrimage for visiting artists, a testament to a talent that had been rescued from oblivion. Lady Beatrice had never truly reconciled herself to the new regime. She had married a baronet from a neighboring county and now presided over her own, impeccably ordered, emotionally sterile household. She visited Blackwood twice a year, on Christmas and Easter, and was always perfectly, icily polite. She never spoke of Isabella, and she never, ever set foot in Ilara's studio. Her absence was a gift. Later that evening, after Arthur was asleep, Ilara and Alastair sat together in the library. A log fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing glow on the book-lined walls. It was their favorite room, the heart of their shared life. Alastair was reading a new biography of Napoleon, and Ilara was sketching in her book, a quick, fond study of her husband's profile, the way the firelight caught the silvering at his temples. He looked up, catching her eye. "What?" he asked, a smile playing on his lips. "I'm just seeing you," she said. His smile deepened. He put his book aside and reached for her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "After all this time, I am still discovering new parts of the estate that are in disrepair," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Last week, I found a series of cottages near the old mill. The roofs are failing, the windows broken.
They have been abandoned for decades. We can restore them, Elara said immediately. Thomas Gillingham could draw up the plans. We could offer them to the younger families from the village. Yes, he said, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. We can. It will take time, and money, and a great deal of patient work. He looked into her eyes, his own gaze clear and full of a love that was as steady and as real as the stone walls of their home. But we are good at that, are we not? Finding the things that have been neglected and bringing them back to life. Elara's heart was so full it felt as if it might spill over. She thought of the lonely, grieving woman who had arrived on this doorstep 5 years ago, with nothing but her father's legacy and her own fierce, fragile pride. She had been hired to paint a simple portrait, to maintain a lie. Instead, she had found a buried truth, and in doing so, had unearthed her own future. She had found a home. She had found a partner. She had found a love that was not a confection of pale colors and pretty words, but a deep, vibrant, and enduring masterpiece, built on a foundation of profound and unflinching truth. She brought his hand to her lips and kissed his knuckles. Yes, my love, she whispered. We are.